Welcome back to the seminar on foreign direct investment, political risk, and investment promotion agencies. We've gone over foreign direct investment and the basics of foreign direct investment, identified the perspectives of the different players in the international investment arena, and are now going to move into a more nuanced discussion of the risk-reward equation facing foreign investors in emerging market and developed countries. We're really going to focus on the risk side so that we can look and see why foreign investors might forego what are otherwise very attractive opportunities in certain countries based on cursory understandings of risks that really, in some cases, don't exist or can be managed. We're going to move forward with the presentation that we left off on. If you bear with me here for a second, I'm going to bring it up. As I mentioned before, many surveys of executives at multinational companies who are entering emerging market countries, when asked what their primary concern is, answer political risk. While they answer political risk, certain executives are not always familiar with the specific ways in which political risks impact projects. And so we're going to try and demystify the term political risk and go through examples and scenarios of how they impact projects. More specifically, here's the roadmap for the second half of the presentation. We're going to establish the scope of political risk, identify the proper definition, look at the specific risks and examples. How are these scenarios caused? What are the precursors? How can they be assessed? How can they be managed? And then we'll provide a few short examples of how they help investment promotion agencies, how this knowledge can help and empower economic development efforts. So the definition that I think is the most accurate is one of the definitions that is broadest in scope for political and country risk. And it's the risk of a strategic, financial, or personnel loss for a firm because of such non-market factors as macroeconomic and social policies and regulations, as well as events related to political instability. What I want you to distill from this definition are two main concepts. One is policies and regulations implemented by host governments at the federal and subnational level that can impact foreign investments. And then the second item is events which aren't necessarily associated with the actions of host governments, but are related to the political climate in general. And when we talk about events, we're talking, as I mentioned, about revolution, insurrection, and other examples of political violence. Let's go to more specific examples of policies and regulations that can impact foreign investments. While there are myriad ways in which these impact outcomes, we're really just going to focus on the four primary political risk perils. And so what we're looking at first is direct expropriation, which is a scenario where the host government, by law or by decree, officially declares that the assets and the overall investment of a multinational company that is a foreign investor becomes the official property of the host government and its constituents. An example was in 2012 when the Argentinian government announced and ruled by decree that it would officially become the controlling and the owner of a Spanish-owned energy company. The company at the time was worth $5 billion, and there was a long process for compensating the foreign investor, which is governed by international law, beyond the scope of this conversation. But you should know that there is international law governing such events, or such actions more specifically, that are the result of official decrees. We then look at an indirect expropriation. An indirect expropriation has the similar or the same outcome as a direct expropriation as far as the impact on the foreign investor. But it's not an official decree or law which declares that the investment becomes the property of the host government. It's merely a regulation, a policy, or a law that impacts foreign investors. So an example is in 2012, there were foreign investors in Indonesia who were exploring and extracting natural resources and then exporting them to various countries throughout the world. After the inception of the project, the Indonesian government implemented a ban on exports of unprocessed minerals, which prevented the foreign investor from exporting its product, thus decimating the project and rendering the business model ineffective. The next example is of a currency and convertibility, which are essentially capital controls that prevent foreign investors from converting currency in the host country into the currency of the home country and repatriating it back. And finally, we all know about breach of contract. Is simply a scenario where a host government has committed to certain provisions under a contract and does not uphold or live up to those obligations. Now, we talked about direct expropriation. I just want to explain how an understanding from a political science perspective can really help foreign investors and host governments understand the causes and the signals for direct expropriation. For example, international politics becomes a very important aspect or precursor to a direct expropriation. Let me give you an example. If you have a host country in the United States, when Intel made its decision to invest in Costa Rica, the home country was the United States and the host country was Costa Rica. In the event that the Costa Rican government was experiencing economic problems or for some other reason decided that it is going to expropriate some foreign investments, then the United States investments would not be a primary target because the relationship between the two countries is not strained. However, where there is a conflicting or a difficult relationship between the host government and the home government, then foreign investors from the home government might be targets of a direct expropriation that foreign investors from a country with whom the host country has a decent or good relationship might be less vulnerable. So when we look at industry exposures, those industries which produce and extract and export commodities will be more likely to be the targets of a direct expropriation than other industries. And the reason why is because commodity production usually is extracting a natural resource that is the part of the territory of the host country, which makes it therefore a little more controversial. But also, because these commodities are traded and sold on a global market, the government will not have a hard time selling and marketing the product, the commodity, once they have made it the property of the government. For something more specialized, where it's harder to find a specific client or customer, the industry will be less exposed because there's less incentive for the host government to expropriate the project. Moving to indirect expropriation, as I mentioned before, is not a direct seizure of the foreign investment. It's merely a policy or a regulation that has the same effect of a direct expropriation, but is not the official declaration that the foreign host government owns the assets. So, for example, there were foreign investors in Indonesia that were extracting natural resources, and as part of their business model, were exporting the minerals that they extracted to the home country and to other countries. And after the inception of the project, the host government imposed a ban on such exports, which not only prevented the business model from operating moving forward, it decimated the project and rendered it unprofitable, which is tantamount to an expropriation. The causes are somewhat similar to a direct expropriation, but in understanding the more specific causes of an indirect expropriation, we need to look at domestic politics. And an example of a domestic political situation that might impact a company from an indirect expropriation is regime change. For example, where a foreign investor goes into a host country under the relationship of an incumbent host government, and an election is upcoming, the new regime which comes in may be incentivized to interrupt relationships held by the previous regime and pass regulations that impact those foreign investments. When we talk about representative democracies, those are host governments where regime change happens frequently, and where the regime change happens between parties that have conflicting ideologies. An agreement with a host government under one ideology, under one investment contract, which is safe under the incumbent, might then become very exposed to an indirect expropriation afterwards. And so another important thing to understand is that certain industries are more exposed to indirect expropriation than others. And those are the ones with fixed investments. This is called the obsolescence bargain, which is essentially a fancy way of saying that companies which have immobile investments in host countries are more of targets of indirect expropriation because they cannot avoid the negative consequences by easily moving their project to another country. So when a host government wants to extract more revenue from a successful foreign investment project by imposing windfall taxes on the foreign country, they are more likely to target a foreign investment project that's in natural resources than a foreign investment project that is manufacturing widgets in a facility that it's renting, because the latter can more easily move from the host country to another country to establish and manufacture its product. An oil company which has identified potential reserves in a specific area of the host country is set in on that country and cannot move and avoid the consequences like a nimble manufacturing of widgets company. Let's move to currency and convertibility. This is a very prevalent form of loss that foreign investors fear. And in order to understand currency and convertibility, we need to understand how subsidiaries get their money in and out of host countries and back to home countries or banks in third-party countries. So let's take the example of Intel with the parent company in California and then the subsidiary in Costa Rica. And let's say that in this scenario, the Costa Rican subsidiary has funds in the local currency in the host government's banks and is trying to move those funds back to banks in the parent country. In order to do so, they're going to need the approval of the Costa Rican central bank to convert funds denominated in the Costa Rican currency into US dollars, and then receive approval from the central bank to move those funds from the host country's bank to a bank in the home country. Now, what are the causes of currency and convertibility? Well, let's talk about the definition first. If an insured is unable to convert local currency earnings or debt service to hard currency and to repatriate it in a timely way, then currency and convertibility has taken place. What happens is central banks often impose capital controls to restrict domestic and foreign investors and residents from moving their money out of the country. There are many scenarios in which this happens, although a prevalent one is a devaluation, which lessens the value of currency in the host country and encourages account holders to take their money out of the banks and move it to a foreign country denominated in another currency. In order to prevent these devaluations from happening, host governments often impose capital controls that restrict the movement of funds. This gets very technical and complicated, but understanding that the specific potential for such capital controls can help industries and host governments understand their true exposure. Let's move to political violence. Political violence, as we mentioned, can take the form of an insurrection, a revolution, a coup, any civil unrest. These all have subtle differences in their definitions, which can be significant in claim situations for insurance and other forms of getting compensated for losses. But what's important to know about political violence and how it impacts foreign investors is that these type of events can either damage physical property of foreign investors, mobile assets that are owned by foreign investors, or it can be scenarios where the political violence has caused work stoppages on projects from foreign investors. And these work stoppages are called business interruptions that ultimately prevent foreign investors from generating revenue over a period of time and really can have significant impact on the outcome of a project. So that's how events can cause problems. Let's look specifically at examples of how this type of information can help investment promotion agencies. And in short summary of what we just spoke about, as I mentioned before, foreign investors have identified upside of projects in emerging market countries. But in many cases, they don't themselves, even though they fear political risk, may not necessarily have a comprehensive command over what political risk is. And so in the abstract, they understand that a host government may provide political risks. But when truly trying to understand the specific ways in which it might impact an investment, they may not be that familiar and may thus forego a project based on a cursory understanding of political risk. So let's take the example of a US company interested in going into country X. And in that country, there is a lot of political violence. And thus, the reputation of the country has been associated with political risk. However, let's say that that same investor was in an industry that was operating in parts of the country that weren't affected by political violence, and in industries that aren't exposed to losses by political violence and are more exposed to other types of political risks like indirect expropriation or currency and convertibility. In such a case where a host government can identify the difference between the perceived risk of the foreign investor and the real risk of the foreign investor, highlight this discrepancy to the foreign investor, then they may be able to have more traction with the foreign investor and get the foreign investor to focus more specifically on the potential rewards associated with the host government than worried about a perceived risk, which really is not real. These are the ways in which understanding industry-specific exposures can really help host governments. And so we're going to move, I know it's getting long in this presentation, we're going to move finally to the tools that are out there for deterring and mitigating exposures to political risk. There's legal tools, there's insurance tools, there's corporate diplomacy, and there's operational strategies. When we look at the specific legal tools available to foreign investors to manage these risks, two stand out in high relief from the others. Bilateral and multilateral investment treaties provide protections for foreign investors that exceed the protections for investors from host countries that don't have bilateral investment treaties. So a host government and a home government will enter into a bilateral or multilateral investment treaty in which the host government promises to provide a certain level of protection to foreign investors from the home country. And there, the host government is far less likely to act on any initial movement to interfere with the foreign investment. And in the event that they do, the foreign investor will then have a direct cause of action against the host government, enabling them to sue an international arbitration and try to recover for damages. In order to make sure that a company qualifies for a treaty, there is a certain amount of due diligence that needs to take place prior to the investment to ensure the type and scope of protections can manage the project effectively. But just know that countries which have bilateral investment treaties with other home countries can more accurately and convincingly encourage foreign investment from that investors in the home country. There's also the specific agreements between foreign investors and host governments that are called investment contracts. And in these, there are a number of clauses that can help assuage the fears of foreign investors in a real and effective and inexpensive way. And these are examples of the ways in which they can do it. There's clauses that call for the stabilization of regulatory and legal frameworks. There's options for renegotiating terms that may be problematic. There's sovereign immunity waivers and many other options at the disposal of host governments and of companies that are trying to mitigate their risks. Ultimately, there's also insurance. Political risk insurance covers such political exposures and can also deter host governments from taking action. And finally, in addition to insurance, there's operational strategies that can minimize companies' exposures. I'll give you one final example, and then we'll close up in a couple minutes. But the final example is, let's say you're a company from a foreign investor from the United States going into country Y. Country Y has a history of implementing capital controls and thus is a high risk for a currency inconvertibility scenario. Rather than funneling your money through banks in the host country, there are, in some scenarios, there are options for parent companies to set up the flow of funds through third-party banks in third-party countries, and thus avoid the exposure and the need to bank in the host country. And so there are many operational strategies available to foreign investors that really can help them avoid political risks and the damages that result with due diligence and planning ahead of the inception of the project. In conclusion, the ultimate message is that foreign direct investment can be a very beneficial tool for host governments who are trying to attract the interest of big projects from around the world. To reinforce the motivation and the primary objectives of host governments, I know we probably all know too well, we're looking to generate jobs, capital investment, and technology transfer. However, in many cases, the foreign investor, where they identify solid upside, solid opportunities, may forego such opportunities based on a simple and cursory understanding of the investment climate, and will sometimes conclude erroneously that there is a significant political risk exposure in the host country. By identifying and understanding the specific ways in which general political risk exposures manifest into particular perils, Host governments can narrow the scope of risk, identify the discrepancy between the perceived risk from the foreign investors and the real risk. And then in the event that the foreign investor is still concerned about a political risk exposure, host governments can recommend a universe of options for managing, mitigating, deterring those risks, some of which require money, some of which don't, some of which are operational strategies, some of which are legal, some of which are insurance. In order to learn more about this, I'm more than happy to talk to anyone. Please feel free to contact your representative, and he will then put me in touch with you. I appreciate your time. I understand this is a very technical topic, but it's one that's very germane to the foreign investments in emerging market countries. And really, at the end of the day, this knowledge can help foreign investors focus on the rewards of doing business in certain countries and not become abnormally concerned about the risks. Thank you for your time.